I am Chief Petty Officer Gerald Martin of the HMS Wolverine of the 3rd Fleet of the Royal Manticorian Navy, the official fan organization for David Weber's Honorverse. And I'm here with the Duke of Lutzenvale, Mr. David Weber himself, author of the Honor Harrington series, as well as the Safehold series, In Fury Born, the Bazelle series, and many others that I can't even, there's a huge list of works that we could go through. And he has graciously agreed to an interview today for HonorCon and for the Royal Manticorian Navy organization. So I hope you guys enjoy, and thank you, Mr. Weber. We really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. You guys are great.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate it. Without you, we wouldn't have a universe to play in.
Well, you know, I write the books, and I kind of structure the universe, and I create the characters in it. But it's the readers of the books who actually flesh out that universe. Because I have told many, many people over the years, and if you've been at a convention with me, you probably heard me say this before, but there is nobody in the entire world who has ever read a single book I've written. There are people who have read the book that I wrote from their perspective, bringing their life experience and their understanding of the characters to it, and that means that for every single person who reads the book, it's a different experience. And the fact that people are deeply invested enough in them to want to join an organization like the TRMN, to me says I got it right in terms of what I created, but it also says a great deal about them, because if you look at the organization and the people in it and how it's structured and what it's doing, they're a pretty good bunch of folks. And the fact that they decided to invest their time in the Honorverse, I'm honored by that.
No pun intended, right?
No, no pun intended. A friend of mine at LibertyCon used to have a panel that he liked to do, David Weber, the Man Without Honor, in which you could talk about any of my books except the Honorverse books, you know.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I think we've got some panels scheduled for you at HonorCon that are different takes on honor and some of the uses of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you were talking about how the readers get from your writing basically what their experiences and what their influences have brought to it. What would you consider some of your biggest influences in your writing, or what experiences have influenced you the most?
Well, to start with, I'm a historian by training and by inclination. I don't know if that could possibly be anything anybody might have noticed in the books. I have a deep and abiding love for history, and I strongly believe that, I think it was Gerry who said, people who don't study history are lucky if they get to repeat it instead of something worse happening. I think that's true. But I'm also fascinated by the way events and forces and people come together to create history. I think a lot of people, they tend to look at the way things are right now, and they see everything else in terms of that reference. And they forget that what you're looking at is history is this incredible movie, and where we are right now is one freeze frame out of that movie. And everything in that freeze frame comes from somewhere else, and it leads somewhere else. And so those strands and threads all sort of flow through in any given moment. So that's part of where I come from. Another part, and to be honest, I also, my big area of interest, and again, I don't know if I can possibly recognize this, is military and diplomatic history. But when you move beyond that, I've always been fascinated by the way human personalities form and interact. And I'm not, I don't want to get, deep and profound and mystic about it, but it's an error to say that to understand all is to forgive all, or, you know, but it is true that the more you understand someone, the less you are able to see them in terms of stark villainy, because you begin to grasp they may live on a different planet from you in terms of their value structure, but if you understand what their value structure is, then what they are doing becomes understandable. It may not become forgivable, but it becomes understandable.
Black and white becomes those shades of gray.
And I think it still stays black and white, but you understand the palette that each side is painting from. Okay? It doesn't matter, for example, to take one example, if somebody is a terrorist fanatically devoted to a proposition that you cannot accept and change to without destroying your own way of life, your own value system, then it doesn't matter how well you understand him. It doesn't matter how nobly motivated he may be from his perspective and his cultural baggage. He's still the enemy, and one of you is going to have to go. Okay, so but I think also, I started reading science fiction when I was 10 years old. I'd already read all of Walter Farley's Stallion novels. I'd already read all of the You Were There at Lexington and Concord and whatnot books. And I had broken an arm, and so I was kind of curtailed in what else I could do. So I started on my dad's science fiction collection, and the first novel I ever read was Jack Williamson's Legion of Space. Okay, and then the next one after that was Sprague de Camp and Schuler Mitchell's Genus Homo. Which is,
familiar with.
oh, it's pretty good, especially for something that was written in the gosh, the late 30s, the early 40s.
Oh wow!
And then from there, I did everything Doc Smith ever wrote, which people may perhaps see some traces of influence in what I write. And then I did the Heinlein, and the Asimov was never really that much my cup of tea. Murray Leinster, Gordy Dixon, just, you know, there was so much that was turning up at that point. The advice that I give anybody who wants to write is that they should write what they enjoy reading, that type of fiction, because you'll do it better, because the enjoyment quotient will keep you doing it longer, and because if you like it, someone else likes it, which means there is a market for it somewhere. Okay, unless you're, you know, Ted Bundy or something like that. So those were the kind of elements that pulled me together. Although it took me some time to realize, and I was glad that I got her told, and I did realize. Annie McCaffrey had a very, very deep, but in some ways subtle, impact on me as a writer. When I read the Pern novels, and dating myself, I was in high school when the Pern novels came out, and I read the first one in serialization. I think it was an analog, before it was ever published between its own covers. But while I was reading it, it was occurring, something was going on in the back of my brain. It took me a while to figure out what it was the realization that there was an entire world behind those stories. Okay? That there was a society, there were political interactions, there was a history, that there was a real world, that if you look at a lot, especially a fantasy, okay, you would get the impression the entire world was the size of Connecticut. Because that's how much climate variation there is, that's how much difference there is politically between, you know, who's where, you know, what's going on. And the Pern novels weren't like that. Okay. And it took me a while to realize that has kind of been the standard to which I have tried to work in first creating a framework for the story, before I create the story.
Okay.
When I got ready to do the first Honor Harrington novel, I did an 80,000-word essay on the Honorverse before I wrote the first word of the first story. And I dealt with politics, I dealt with technology, I dealt with medicine, I dealt with interstellar travel, I dealt with how the diaspora worked and what waves were involved in it, and put all of that in place.
So it's your own House of Steel, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't develop it in as much detail as I have since developed it in the novels, but it was all there, and that helps to explain the consistency, the continuity in the books. There are continuity errors in the books. Usually when I have a continuity error, it's because I assumed that my memory was correct and didn't check my notes when I did something. And that happens. I think it was Poul Anderson who said, perfect continuity, perfect consistency is possible only for the Almighty, and a careful reading of Scripture will indicate that even He missed it occasionally. And I think there's some truth to that, but that's because the editors messed it up.
Yeah.
You know, but the notion of actually building the world. Okay, now in the Bazell novels, that universe was created initially in 1968. And was the home to so many RPG campaigns and games over the next 40 years that it's fully developed.
So what we're seeing when we read the Bazell novels, what we're seeing is basically just a small glimpse into this whole overarching world that you've been creating for almost 40 years.
Oh, yeah. But that's why the political relationships are so well defined in it, and why the systems of government and so forth. Now the novels, I haven't attempted to recreate any of the campaigns in the universe, and because I was already into that McCaffrey mindset. And I think I was probably there before I read the Pern novels, but the Pern novels are what told me this is what science fiction should be like, as opposed to this is how you should run an RPG. I was doing Dungeons and Dragons before Gygax had ever written the first book, using Greyhawk and Chainmail and those rules for the tabletop miniatures to do it. By the time I was 19, people insisted that I had to run the universe instead of running around in the universe, you know, and I got even with them with some of the things I did. My favorite was the time that I sold the party of adventurers an entire cask of dehydrated water for their trip across the desert. Yeah, they didn't bother to think about dehydrated, you know, what does that mean? I tell them it was full of water when I, you know. But anyway, that kind of experience causes you to not want to leave loose ends. And the other thing that it does for you is it encourages you to create a situation in which you are absolutely resolved that you are not going to give your characters a god weapon when you paint yourself into a corner. They live or die based on what you've established they can do
no Deus
in
Ex
the
Machina.
universe. Yeah. Even in Out of the Dark, which a lot of people have been upset with me over, you know, and all some mistakes. Okay, there are hints in there about who you're dealing with from the first time you meet him. Okay, it's not my fault you didn't pay attention because you didn't see it coming. Yeah, I did that originally as a short story, and Tom Doherty at Tor asked me to expand it into a full-length novel because of how much he liked the story. So I did, and I really liked the book. I had no intention of it being a series, and didn't know that Tor thought it was going to be one until they started marketing it when it first came out as the first book in a new series. And I know exactly where I would take it to turn it into a series. But I need a new series like I need a hole in the head. You know, I've got enough of those, and enough people saying, "Where's the next book in my series?" You know.
So do you recommend, you were talking about your influences, do you have, based on your game mastering experience as well as your reading experience, do you have a list of recommended works? I know you mentioned Heinlein and McCaffrey. Do you have a list of recommended works for people to read, or your own personal reading list?
Not really, and the reason I say that is the most important thing if you're going to be a successful writer is that you develop your own voice. Now, all of us are the product of everything we've ever read. Every writer is, even if it's like, oh my God, I'm never going to do that, you know, or ooh, that I got to figure out how to steal that. Let me see, file off the serial numbers. You know, I have a Paul Anderson line I fully intend to steal at some point because it's so great. And plagiarism, you know, is the most sincere form of flattery. but anyway.
Lyndon Heinlein that said to find the best and steal
from the best, yes. Well, and there's truth to that. But I think that you have to find your own reading list rather than being directed to someone else's. Okay, now I would say, you know, there are books that I hugely enjoy. For example, I am a huge Liaden universe addict with Chairman Lee and Steve Miller.
Published by Baen, I believe.
I think they are now. And I was a huge Keith Laumer fan. Read everything H.P. Piper ever wrote. But the main thing is, as a writer, you have to be comfortable telling the story your way. And it has to be a way that works for the readership. The first solo novel that I ever sold, the first two, were Mutineer's Moon and The Armageddon Inheritance. Both of which were bought at the same time by Jim Baen. But Jim didn't want to buy them initially. He rejected them. And he sent me this long list of things that he thought I needed to do differently. And I read his list, and I thought, you know, 10% of it or so he was right on. And another 10% I could, either way. And the other 80% he was full of crap. Which was pretty audacious from someone who was selling book number 2 and book number 3 of his entire career. But I said, okay, so I went through and I did the 10% where I thought he was absolutely right on. I held the 10% that I could live with in reserve as something I could concede and give up, you know. And Jim was saying to me, you know, well, okay, you know, how about, you know, I'll buy these two, we'll publish them under a pseudonym, and then you write a book the way I'm telling you to, we'll sell it under your name, we'll see who's right, you know, kind of thing. So I did the 10%, I saved the 10%, and then I went through and did a global re-edit, turning was-nots into wasn'ts and is-nots into isn'ts. And it reduced each book by between all the changes and everything else, reduced each book by about 4,000 words, most of which was consonants that had come along. And I sent it back to Jim, and I said, Jim, you know, I've thought about what you said, and I've given effect to the parts that, you know, I agreed with, you know. And in the process, you know, that reduced each book by 4,000 or 5,000 words. He was got back. This is great. This is wonderful. This is exactly what I wanted you to do. And he never found out that, because nobody expected to lose him to that stroke when he was so young. And I was saving it to tell him. And he died, and I never got a chance to tell him. But that was the only changes that I made in the first two books. And I'm not holding that up necessarily as the pattern card for how you ought to do it. If an editor tells you, I will buy this if you change thus and so, at least until you are a well-established writer, you should say, of course, I'll get right on that. A good editor will tell you, I have a problem and this is why, rather than I have a problem and here is how I want it fixed. And I've been fortunate in the editors that I've had in that regard. Tony Weisskopf at Bain has been my editor ever since Honor of the Queen. And I think, well, okay, Jim Binns is my editor now, but because of the relationship that I've had with Tony, she and I still spend a lot of time talking directly about, you know, where we want to go, what we want to do next. And I owe a lot to her. Tony is a very good editor, and one of the things that she did with me was we would finish a book, and she would, after we got past Crusade, which is a story in itself, she usually didn't have a whole lot of editorial changes to suggest in a given book, but what she would do is sort of an after-action report when we got done, and say, okay, I'd like you to think about for the next book, you did this one, you know, all the way through here, you might want to think about doing that differently in the next one, or something like that. That's very useful. But as far as a specific reading list, my advice is simply read. I was a Georgette Heyer fan. Regency romances.
Ah, okay.
And this was back when I was riding the motorcycle. And I had the beard down to here, the braid that went all the way down to the back. I would wear my motorcycle leathers, and I would creak into the local bookstore, go back to the romance section, and all the ladies back there would be like, oh my God, you know, shrinking back against the walls. And I'd look, and I'd say, there's a new edition of Sylvester. This is great, you know, and then I'd walk out with it. They'd all be like, what was that, you know? So there's not really, there are no genres that are silver bullets or golden keys, but there are also no genres that are useless, no matter what you eventually wind up writing. There's nothing out there that you can read that won't contribute to the platform from which you approach. It's kind of like Howard, okay? If you read sword, you know, hack and chop, you know, the big tough fantasy kind of thing, you're reading Howard, even though you may be 2 or 3 iterations down. You may never have actually read a Conan story or a Solomon Kane story that he himself wrote. That DNA is still in there. It's still being transmitted down. And, you know, Tolkien just had a stupendous effect on the world of fantasy writing. But if you go back, I'm trying to remember the author's name, he wrote The Worm Ouroboros. Peake, I think his last name was. Melvin Peake, I think it was. Probably wrong. But anyway, you can trace that through this as well, even though most people never heard of him today. Most of the reading public today never heard of him.
No, but I'm going to be looking him up.
And so, you know, it's kind of follow your own tastes as a reader, okay? And don't let anybody look down their nose at you because of what it is you choose to read. Okay, don't let anybody tell you, well, that's lowbrow or whatever. Because what matters is what you as a reader get out of that book. There are people out there who I consider to be every bit as good a writer as I am, who never had a series that caught fire like Honor Harrington or something like that. And it's not because there's any fault at all in the books, and I love the books, okay? But they just never, whatever combination of hitting at the right moment or whatever, you know, it's like, oh. There are people who write stuff that other friends of mine love that I cannot read, okay? I just can't get into it. It doesn't work for me. That's not necessarily a comment on the writer. It's a comment on the writer-reader relationship that exists. Okay? So, anyway.
Well, you were talking about that an author needs to find his own voice, that he needs to basically write in the style and the manner in which they're most comfortable. Well, I know with the Honor Harrington series in particular, you have actually started to branch out with co-authors and anthologies with people that aren't you. How has it felt, and what was it like starting to kind of, I guess, give up some of that creative control, or have you given up that creative control?
Well, you have to bear in mind that the very first novel I ever sold was a collaboration with Steve White, Insurrection, which was set in a gaming universe that I had done editorial and creative work in, and that was the basis for the story. That was an accidental novel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we never sat down initially to write a novel. I wrote short stories whenever I started a game design project to myself to kind of set the tone, because mostly I did scenario-based situations. And so I did a short story which wound up being the chapter Duty in Insurrection, the one where Lee Han faces down the Super Dreadnought. And I sent it to Steve, who was a friend we'd met through the gaming. And he did a short story that he sent back to me, which became the chapter Drumbeat, the one in which the forces under Ian Trevane destroy the light cruiser that his son is assigned to. And that caused me to do one, and him to do one, and me to do one, and it occurred to me that what we were actually doing was writing the chapters in a novel, that the spine of was the storyline that I'd come up with for the game that I was working on. And eventually we had 285,000 words. Which I reduced to 180 before we submitted it anywhere, thinking, well, I've cut 100,000 words out of it, it must be short enough now. It was not. We finally got it down to about 130,000, 135. We worked for a year with John Douglas at Avon, and we couldn't get it down to a length that the suits would let him buy as a first novel. And he told me finally, he said, David, I feel bad about this because you've worked with us for a year on it, done everything we asked you to do. Everybody's read it, we all love it, and you can't take anything else out. So what I want you to do is to withdraw it and submit it someplace that does more specifically military-oriented science fiction. And I want you to tell them the only reason I didn't buy it was length because of the front office, and they should call me so I can tell them that myself. That's about as good a rejection as you're going to get. So I sent it to Bain Books, which, unbeknownst to me, had only been in existence for about 18 months. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
And about 10 days later, I get this phone call that says, "Hi, my name is Tony Weiskopf. I'm with Bain Books, and I'd like to buy your book." Okay. Don't you want to know how much? No. And that was how the first book was sold. So, and I did advertising for years before I sold the first novel. So you have to be able to, even when the client is wrong, the client is right. And it's your job to minimize the damage if they just insist on doing it that way, and to turn what you're required to work with into the most effective product you can turn it into. So from that perspective, I had some pretty good grounding in, how do you deal with editorial criticism. Now, as a friend of mine who needed graduate school said to me about 7 years ago, he said, I'm not the kind of guy who knows New York Times best-selling writers. And I said, well, I'm not the kind of guy who is a New York Times best-selling writer, I guess. He said, no, he said, I can honestly say I've been knowing you now for 25, 30 years, and you haven't changed, success hasn't changed you one bit. I said, really? He said, no, you had an ego on you that was a mile wide then, So I was like, thank you, Kent, But I've lost track of the question.
The creative control.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Getting back to that. I'm still in control in the Honorverse. Let's take Eric and me for an example. Okay. When I play in Eric's sandbox, Eric makes the rules and has the final edit. Okay. When he plays in my sandbox, I make the rules and have the final edit. Now, there are a couple of places where I let Eric do things that I definitely would not have done, okay, myself, because they worked into the story that he was telling in his part of the book, okay? And there have been occasions where there's been at least one occasion where I more or less threw up my hands and said, okay, Eric, we'll do it your way. It doesn't really fit in the tech base of the Honorverse, but we'll do it your way because it's your story. That didn't work, you know, kind of thing. But by and large, that's not a problem. With the stories and the anthologies, for the most part, somebody gives me an idea of what they want to do. I may direct them towards a specific era in the Honorverse when that would have been happening, or whatever. I will, if they ask me questions about the technology, I will either explain them or nowadays refer them to Tom Pope, who knows the Honorverse's tech base even better than I do at this point, literally. To make sure that we get that part of it as right as we can. And then I try to stand back and do the least possible editing on what they're writing. The editing that I try to do deals only with, is this going to A, contradict something that's been set in stone in the Honorverse already, or B, is it going to nail my feet to the ground on something that I want to do further down the road? Which is why, if you look, all of the stories that have been published in the Honorverse are behind where the Honorverse has advanced to in the novels. Okay. There are none that are set in the future of the novels. They're all set either contemporaneous to the most recent novel or further back. And that part of that is, I made it a rule of thumb when I wrote, not a rule of thumb, a hard and set rule, before I began Basilisk Station, that's a reading title, not a pronouncing title, on Basilisk Station. I made it a rule that there would never be an Honor Harrington novel set earlier than Basilisk. There might be short fiction, there might be novels about other folks in the Honorverse, but there would never be an Honor Harrington novel set earlier than Basilisk Station. And the reason was that I wanted to avoid something that you can see very clearly, for example, in the Hornblower series. The first three novels are Hornblower already as an established captain of the list. And this is the early Hornblower, while Forster's still working out exactly who the character is, and his own writing style is growing progressively better. The latest novels, with the exception of Admiral Hornblower in the West Indies, or Lord Hornblower, I think, in the West Indies, is set earlier than Beat to Quarters. All right? And because of that, the best developed Hornblower is almost Mr. Midshipman Hornblower, rather than Lieutenant or Captain or Admiral Hornblower.
Because it was written last.
Because the order in which the books were written. So if you read the books in chronological order by release, you get the smoothing, the development of the character. If you read them in internal chronological order, you're going, and then all of a sudden, bam, you hit this pothole where the character you're dealing with doesn't, there are a lot of things that should have been part of that character because of his earlier experiences that now are not there.
Got it.
Okay? And that's where prequels can get you into a lot of trouble.
So we'll never see an Honor Harrington prequel?
Well, you've seen quite a few of them, but in the form of short stories,
not as a novel.
Midshipman Harrington. Yeah, not as a novel. Now, one of these days I do want to write the novel about her father's service as a Marine and whatnot before he became a physician. And there are some other things that I'd like to do. But Tim Zahn and I, and Tom Pope, the Manticore Ascendant series, the first one of which is Called to Duty, which I think is an August release.
August is the art release. The actual release is October.
Okay. There are actually 3 authors on that book, even though only 2 of us appear on the spine. And Tim and I did a note in the front that says Tom Pope is every bit a co-author. He's credited on the contract with Bain, and he will be on the spine of future books in the series. But one of the things that occurred to us was that if we had 3 authors on the spine, on the title page, on the first book, that people might think it was another anthology, another collection of short stories, rather than realizing that it was a novel. It's very good, in my opinion. And I deliberately took a back seat on this one. Tim and Tom and I sat down and discussed when and where this was to be written. We springboarded off of the story that Tim had done in one of the anthologies, A Call to Duty. And one of the reasons that I'm doing editing, I'm doing oversight, I'm doing like, no, we can't go there if they start to go someplace, and I'm going like, you know, if Tim and Tom hit a plot hole where like Tim wants to do something and Tom is saying no, the technology won't let you do that. They work very well on solving those, but every so often they hit one where they can't find a good way. Well, see, I can kind of swoop in and say, okay, look, guys, obviously we either have to modify something here in the tech base, or we have to find a way to work around it. So here's my suggestion about how we do a workaround, you know, that kind of thing. But other than that, I am deliberately trying to stay out of the editorial process because I love Tim's writing. He's one of the best writers I know. And I want these books to have a different voice from the Honor Harrington books. Remember I was talking about, okay, and I'm totally satisfied with the voice that Tim and Tom between them are evolving for these books. So I'm there in the background. I'm there in terms of the story and how it fits into the history of the Star Kingdom and, you know, where it's going and how it's going to plug in and all the rest of it. But I'm even trying to keep my hands off of the nuts and bolts of the technology, because Tom understands the tech at the Honorverse, the Honor Harrington era period, as well as I do. And I'm not saying that I'm not consulted and I don't make the final call in some instances, but I want the tech, since it's 400, 500 years earlier, I want it to have that feel of being 400 or 500 years earlier. And I think that having someone else doing kind of the steering on it helps with that. Usually I don't have a big problem working with collaborators. There have been a couple of occasions where, you know, we've hit snags or something like that, but my rule of thumb for doing a collaboration, I won't do one just to increase output.
Right.
Okay.
It's got to have a substance or a place in the universe.
Well, it's kind of like, I won't work with someone I don't expect to enjoy working with. Okay. I won't work with someone whose writing ability I don't highly respect. I won't work with someone unless I think that the final product that we're both working on is going to be at least as good as what either of us would have done alone, and be different from what either of us would have done alone. Okay? The one aspect in which you could almost argue that increasing output might be involved is I have more stories to tell than I have time in which to tell them. So if I can find a collaborator who I really like and who works well with me and who I trust, and that lets me tell an additional story by saying, okay, you go write your half of it, or whatever. Okay.
Here's the outline.
Well, yeah. And when Eric and I work together, okay, we email chapters back and forth, and we run them through the review in Word, and we make marginal notes. And if it's one of my characters, I'll say that he's using in a scene. I say, I don't think that John Simpson would have said it that way. He would have said it this way. Okay, and Eric is like, and what we'll do is we'll make the changes actually in the manuscript so the other guy can read what we're suggesting, but because we did it in the review function, it can always be undone. Okay, so and Eric and I both have ego involvement in what we're writing, but it isn't the kind of ego involvement where we say, no, you cannot touch my work, if you see what I'm saying. Eric is also, Eric is very comfortable working with other writers, which helps. But I've got a pretty high comfort level working with most of the people that I've worked with, at least on multiple books. Some of us, it's like writing schedules and speeds don't mesh smoothly, and so it's really difficult for us to do additional multiple projects. But I can't really think of one where I said a pox upon you and stormed out, and I can't think of one where anybody did that to me. Of course, if anybody did that to me, they were obviously in the wrong.
Of course.
But I mean, these things happen. Some people are not perfect. Yes. Okay.
Well, we've talked about actually the writing process. You've talked a lot about the way writers really should find their own voice and should find their own way of telling their stories. What you just alluded to, though, apparently technology seems to be having quite a bit of an impact on your writing output. For instance, the review function in Word. How is technology assisted or not assisted?
God, I can't imagine how Daniel Defoe did it. I know how Milton did it. He used voice-activated software. It's called his Daughters. Okay, he dictated to them, and when one of them's hand cramped, it wouldn't go anymore. He, and brought up number 2. I did the Insurrection on an Osborne portable computer with 2 92K single-side, single-density discs. That was it. Okay, here's the operating system, and here's the one you're putting the. And I used WordStar, and you could not disable the backup function, which meant that the most you could put on one side of a floppy was 45K. I had a stack, and this was after I punched them so that I could use both sides. I had a stack of discs this tall, and that was Insurrection. Okay, and the display literally was the size of an index card.
I actually remember seeing
computers like the size of a big sewing machine,
yep.
Kind of thing. Then I upgraded to an IBM, probably the second year they were available. And I remember when I got my first hard drive, it was 4 megs. And there was no way on God's green earth I was ever going to fill that puppy up. Okay, it just wasn't going to happen. I went on using WordStar until they went to a WSGI format, because the things you could do with WordStar that you couldn't do with Word at that point went away.
Yeah.
And it got into this really complex frames and everything. I mean, when DOS hit CP/M on the head, that was really kind of the writing was on the wall for anyway, when we sold Insurrection, it was all send the paper manuscript. That's the only way there was to do it. And a lot of people, when you think about it, I know especially, okay, I sold the first book in '89, so we are now the better part of 30 years ago before I sold the first book, and the changes in technology over that 30-year span, they happen so close to the surface of our lives that we don't notice it until we look back. Okay, but I think it may have been Honor Among Enemies was the first novel that I sent to Bain solely as a floppy. And I think that it was like 1 or 2 more down the road before I started routinely emailing them the file when I was done. Now, about 16 years ago, it will be 16 years ago this winter, I broke my wrist into 57 pieces, my right wrist, and they could only, literally, they had 1 piece left over when they put it back together. It was a fragment that they didn't have any place to put.
You must have had a computer guy working on it. You
Oh,
must have at least 1 screw left over.
yes. You know, it was the cup holder with the, anyway. So I have 2 plates and 12 screws and 6 pieces of wire and bone spurs and early onset arthritis in my right hand, and that's why in my right hand and right wrist I can only type for about 40 minutes at a time if I'm typing continuously. And it affects my signings at cons pretty severely these days. It's getting worse. The arthritis is getting worse. But anyway, I was working on something for Jim Bain when I broke my wrist, and I called him up and I said, "Jim, we got a problem." He said, "What's that?" I said, "My wrist is shattered, you know, they're going to have to do a surgical reconstruction on it, I'm not going to be able to type." And he was like, "Oh." I said, "Well, have you ever considered voice-activated software?" And I said, "No." You know? And so he said, "Well, would you be willing to try it if I bought it for you and sent it to you so we get this book done?" So it was Dragon.
Would have been probably 1 or 2.
I think it was 2.1. 2.1 maybe. And I made it work because I had to. Well, I've used it ever since. I'm now on version 12 something. It's improved a lot. It still has maddening things that it will do to you. But I am a very fast typist. I can type about 110 words a minute, fast and dirty. 90 words a minute if I'm trying to keep it, you know, fairly clean with them. I can dictate at 200 words a minute. Now, nobody I know can write at 200 words a minute. But it means that the output per hour that you spend in front of the computer is higher. Okay? Now I have to edit with a keyboard because Dragon does not like it when you tell it, "I want you to look at this 200,000 word manuscript." Because I think not, you know, kind of thing. I work in chapters, sections that are maybe 5,000 to 7,000 words, and then I paste them into the master document when I get done with that chapter. I would say that probably the changes in tech, when I was doing the first few novels, I also had absolutely no life outside my computer at that point. I was in a separation situation with my first wife, you know, and so I basically was like, okay, fine, I might as well spend 14 hours a day doing this, you know. And I also hadn't broken the wrist and whatnot. And I wrote Path of the Fury.
Ah, one of my favorite novels.
The initial novel. I wrote the entire thing in less than 2 months. As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, I wrote the entire thing in about 6 weeks. Never had that happen before, never had it happen since. And it was kind of just, you know, pedal to the metal and go. And then, you know, there's that point about halfway through the original novel where everything kind of goes for a minute, and then you jump into the second half. I mean, and it works. It's not like there's a break in the middle of it. There's, I went to a convention in Lynchburg, and while I was there, well, my Volvo swallowed the timing gears about 10 miles south of Lynchburg.
Oh, wow.
and it was like a '75 Volvo. Okay, that I loved that car. Drove it for forever. Anyway, I think they had to, de-mothball a production facility in Sweden to manufacture the replacement parts. I wound up stuck in Lynchburg after the convention for 10 days. That was when Jane Linscolt and I, who had already met, became really good friends because I stayed with her and her first husband while they were working on the car. She was teaching at Limestone in Lynchburg.
There's Liberty, there's Lynchburg, there's Randolph-Macon, there's Hollins, Central Virginia Community College.
I can't remember. Anyway, she was teaching literature there. Anyway, so I got home, okay, and discovered that my refrigerator had apparently died 20 minutes after I left. I opened the refrigerator, I immediately closed the refrigerator. I called Sears, told them I need a new refrigerator, please take the old one away, bring your hazmat suits. My dog had been at the boarded at my vet's, and apparently I'd left my computer up while I was gone because I wasn't expecting to be gone for the weekend. And apparently, whatever killed the refrigerator was a power spike that also killed the hard drive. I mean, it was gone. And I had just finished before I left Path of the Fury. Okay, no, the Sharp Victorious War. The Sharp Victorious War. That's what it was. So it was gone. Okay, I had like a little more than half of it in a hard copy that was like 4 generations old that I had printed out. That was, except I'd made a backup for it. Okay, except I couldn't find the backup, and demonstrating my slowly developing maturity, I did not punch the computer, instead I punched the wall and promptly broke my hand. So, again, I had to get a new computer in and working with this much of my hand in plaster. So I had this much, doing this, I had to rewrite the entire novel and then send it off to Bain. And I did nothing but work on that book until I finished it. And I mean, the pizza boxes were stacking up, the whole nine yards. So finally, I get it sent off to Bain. And I called Tony, and I said, Tony, computer's gone. I said, can't find the backup, She said, what do you mean you can't find the backup? I said, I can't find the floppy anywhere. And she said, oh my God, So anyways, I got it done, and I sent it off. I decided I should probably dig the house out. Okay. So I started cleaning up the pizza boxes. And Melody Ann, my half lab, half rot. Okay, she's about 100, 110 pounds. Okay, like an oil drum on legs. She had a dog bed that was under the drafting table in the corner of my office. I decided to say, well, I should probably dust Melly's bed. Pulled it out, and there was this chewed up floppy in it that had a label on it that said, the short Ikar on it. And apparently it had fallen on the floor, and because it was on the floor, it was a chew toy. And it was just, so I picked it up and I called Tony. I said, Tony, I told you I did a backup and I just found it. She said, where was it? I said, it was in Melody Ann's bed. She chewed it up. And she said, let me get this straight, David. You're telling me the dog ate your homework. And I was like, well, yeah, actually. But that's the only time that a dog ever ate my homework. But that was technology. And that was one of the drawbacks of technology, and it's why I use Dropbox for the files, and also the fact that I can always have access to the latest version if I'm on my laptop, wherever. Now the problem is, if you're going to do that, though, you have to remember to back up your voice files, your vocabularies, to Dropbox too, so that you can be sure you can pull down the latest version of that for Dragon. Yeah. If you're working on your laptop.
Because otherwise you got to retrain Dragon the entire time.
Yeah, and see, if you're doing something like Safehold, where none of the names have standard spellings, I have to figure out how to pronounce all those names. Okay. The same thing for technical things, like, for instance, LAC, for Light Attack Craft. Okay. It will give you LACK every time. Okay, so basically that's Light Attack Acronym is the term for it. And it's more of its Light Attack acronym plural. and you get to where you just keep right on going, and as far as you're concerned, that's the word. When you get there to drop it in, Dragon says, "Oh, okay, I know what he means," and sticks it in.
That's nice.
Yeah, it is, and I use one of the advanced dragons. I use Legal Solutions because it lets you build multiple vocabularies. Dragon rotates words in and out of the vocabulary based on frequency of use. Okay, so, and the bigger there actually is a level at which the vocabulary starts slowing down because it's got so many words in it. So it makes a lot more sense to have a specialized Norfresa and a specialized Safehold and a specialized Honorverse, because then you just go, you load that profile, that vocabulary, and it hasn't rotated any of your special use words out of memory because you were in Safehold for the last 6 months while you were working and you weren't using.
Makes sense. Well, speaking of technology, we're going to kind of go into the Honorverse for a second. I had a request from Ken, I believe this was probably Ken Odell, who wanted to know where the inspiration for Horace Harkness came from and whether we can ever expect to see maybe his own novella or stuff exploring his background.
Well, I do at some point want to write the courtship of Iris Babcock. I'm not sure where Horace came from. I don't know how true this is for other writers. Okay? I very seldom have a specific character in mind until I get to the point in the story where that character appears. Okay? I never sat down and said, you know, for example, it never occurred to me that Honor Harrington would be anything but female. It was never a conscious decision on my part. I never even thought about it. I knew that the story that...
Hi there.
Hello, Shaughnessy. I knew that the story that I wanted to write was going to have this character in it. Okay? And that was just a given to me. When I started with the Tree Cats, okay, I knew the societal structure of the Tree Cats and everything else. I had not really thought through the relationship between Honor and Nimitz and how it would grow. And, you know, by the time I got to the end of Basilisk Station, I did, even though I deliberately not shown all of that to the reader yet. But when I started, no, I didn't. And I think that's one reason why there is a tendency in my books to have secondary characters take on primary roles. There are very, 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 very few unnamed characters in one of my books. And as I'm going along, when I insert a character, I make an entry in my character list.
I can only imagine how large that character list is.
Well, and the thing is that and I try whenever I create a character that character is more than just a name, okay? And I'll stop and I'll say, okay, what am I going to call this person? And I'll give him a name, and I'll say, okay, now he's a lieutenant in an infantry platoon in Safehold, so he's going to have a platoon sergeant. What's the platoon sergeant's name? And I put that down, and then I go back and I go to the lieutenant. I say, okay, he's 26. He's from a well-to-do family. He's got brown hair. He's got brown eyes. He wears a mustache, and he's missing the tip of his little finger on his left hand. Okay, boom. All that goes in there.
You created a full NPC for almost a game, basically.
Yes, and that is available to me, and it colors what he does and how he does it in the story. And it also means that there's something for the reader to make this person. And now, sometimes that information that I put in there never makes it into the story, and he remains just a name. But he's a name who acts and reacts in a particular fashion because he's this person over here. All right? And so some of those characters, like I say, as the book progresses, as the story progresses, what they have done in the story melds with the development of who they are, to turn them from a spear holder over here into a foreground character over here, into a main character over here.
Has there ever been a character that surprised you all of a sudden, that decided to do something that you weren't expecting?
I haven't had too much of that. I've had characters who would go where I wanted them to go. Whether it was a combination of, well, the way I visualize this character, he or she wouldn't do that. Or if it was a case of I just can't quite force the narrative to work smoothly to get me to that point. And it's always a little hard to say, which is the factor that's keeping you from doing that. I've had some characters who took unexpected places in my heart. In the Honorverse, for example, Michael Oversteegen. Okay, he was originally supposed to be there only to teach Abigail the fact to realize that she was thinking in stereotypes too, the whole time that people were thinking stereotypes about race. And as I worked on the Service of the Sword, I just grew to like Michael more and more and more. And so Michael has emerged into that middle foreground of characters. And I really like his relationship with Mike Hinkey, and so forth. So that happens. But in terms of my going, wow, didn't see that coming, I really can't think of one off the top of my head where that happened to me. And I don't know whether I would be happy if it happened or astonished. I mean, I don't know. I've talked to people who say, oh yeah, I never saw that coming, when I wrote that character, and it was so cool, and that would be fun.
Yeah.
But I've never had it happen. Shaughnessy.
What's up, bud?
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, my master's voice.
Well, your animals obviously play a very large role in your life. I know you have, 4 dogs? 5 dogs?
4 now. Yeah.
4 now, and several cats.
3.
Oh. So how have your animal friends kind of been brought into your stories? I mean, I know you got the tree cats.
Well, Nimitz is, at the time that I was doing the Honor Harrington books, starting them, I had 3 cats. All siblings, all born in my closet. There were 2 gray boys who were gray tabbies, and their sister, who was a little black with blue eyes, whose name was Ming Li. And the 2 gray boys, one of them his name was Bomber. He was born in a nap attack and promptly went back to sleep. The other one was Leonardo, and their dad had a bobcat in him that he still had the mask and the tufted ears. And they were huge. I mean, they were like Maine Coon sized.
Oh,
cats.
wow.
Except that Bomber was shaped like a football. And Leonardo was kind of the long, lean, rangy. And Leonardo had an extra toe on each foot. So he had like these dinner plate sized feet. And Nimitz kind of has Bomber's intellect and Leonardo's personality.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, I mean, that really, they kind of got fused into building him. But I will say this, I never thought of Nimitz as an animal, okay, any more than I think of the coursers in the Bazel novels as animals.
Oh, I love the coursers.
They're characters that just don't happen to be built the same way that the human characters or whatever are. I would say that my experience with animals means that I try to write, for want of a better term, non-human characters realistically. There's a series, which I will not name, people who have read it will probably read it, but which, by the way, I love. But there's one huge, huge problem in it. The aliens in it are 10 feet tall, and they ride horses. And they're not only 10 feet tall and riding horses, but they're executing light cavalry tactics riding horses. Now, if you have a 10-foot person riding a horse, that horse has got to be a percheron, okay? And there is no way in the world you're going to execute light cavalry tactics on that horse. And there's also the problem that in this book you have these hordes of warriors, like 100,000 warriors, all mounted, all with multiple remounts, moving through. And yes, they're moving steadily. That's their lifestyle. But in the books, when they run into somebody who they can't move by and they have to stop and fight, the horses aren't starving to death within 5 days because they've eaten all the forage in the area.
I was going to say their metabolisms would require a hefty amount.
Yeah, and one of the problems I think that people have writing fantasy, I'm straining a little bit here, fantasy or alternate reality science fiction. We are now a sufficiently technological society that the realities of animal-drawn logistics, movement rates, health considerations kind of get left at the title page.
Relegated to the annals of history.
Yeah, and horses are treated as if they're cars. Okay, you get on your horse, you ride to where you need to go, you get off your horse, and your horse is waiting when you tell the valet to bring him from the stall. I mean, it's almost like that, and that's where in the Bazel novels, I have the scenes where Leanna is grooming the horse, and we're talking about the need to rug a horse in cold weather and so forth.
Well, you cover that in Safehold in great detail with the dragons and the horses.
Yes. Now I cheat because I give myself dragons to give me draft animals that let me do logistics that an actual horse traction army wouldn't have been able to do. But when I do that, I explain the logistical framework in which they operate, and then my characters have to live with it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that that's one thing. I don't know whether it's my love for history that pushes me in that way as much as it does, or whether it is my experience with actual livestock. But that's one of the things that you need to deal with. Whether you're writing science fiction or fantasy or historical fiction or whatever, you have got to have a framework in place where the elements work coherently, consistently, and reasonably. If they don't, first, you're not going to write good fiction. And secondly, readers are going to sense that there's something a degree or two off plumb. If you work out details that you never actually put into the book, but are there in the back of your mind while you're writing, then you're going to write the scenes in a particular way every time where that element is in play. And the reader will sense that consistency, will sense that continuity, even if the reader doesn't know the reason you did it that way, because you never found an infamous info dump to put it into to give it to him. But it's there. Okay?
Well, one of the interesting things, I mean, the current state of science fiction and fantasy is one that's ever fluctuating and has its ups and downs, and I'm not sure which period we're in right now, but I know that message fiction is something that's being heavily debated in the science fiction world. Mary wanted to know, how do you balance writing what sells versus telling a message or telling what you want to write?
Well, okay, truth in advertising moment. I'm a Methodist lay speaker, and that is important to me on a personal level. And in some ways, I've been sort of flying religion in under the radar horizon from the very beginning. If you look, for example, at Crusade, and because I'm a historian, and because I try to be honest with myself, I am fully aware of the ways in which religion can be used as a force of destruction, as opposed to a force of construction and creation. And one of the questions that has been a part of my writing now from the very beginning has been individual responsibility. If there's one characteristic that defines someone who is considered by need to be a heroic figure, it's the fact that that character takes responsibility. Not necessarily always just for his or her own actions either. It's if they find a situation that needs to be fixed, whether they created it or not, whether they're responsible for its existence or not, if they can fix it, it's their job to fix it, and they roll up their sleeves and they dig in. Okay, so that's been, if you will, an important message in my writing from the very beginning. However, what makes the books work is that I'm not hitting you over the head with the message. Okay, what I'm doing is I am showing you a character who you find admirable, dealing with the situations, the adversity that comes his or her way. And they're doing it because they take responsibility. Okay? I have tried pretty much to avoid saying, look, I'm going to whack you over the head with this moral message here in my writing. At the same time, every writer has to understand that the instant they begin to write, the instant you begin to write, you climb onto a soapbox, whether you mean to or not, because your beliefs, your values are going to inform the characters and how you build good guys and bad guys in political situations. And you need to be aware of that. Okay? When you get to something like the Safehold books, which, by the way, I pitched as a possible project to Bain Books in the same letter that I pitched Honor Harrington. And, Jim had been looking for someone to do Horatio Hornblower in space for 20 years, and I didn't know it. So he didn't, I don't think, ever bothered to read anything else of the 10 that I sent him. But Honor was one, Safehold was one, and the Multiverse was one of that group. Anyway.
Which has a third one coming out soon.
I'm supposed to be actually meeting with Joelle Presby, who is being my collaborator on them now, in about a week to discuss what she's done on the third one. I already did 90% of my part of it, because I'm handling the military component of it.
Ah, okay.
But anyway, in the Safehold books, I am very explicitly pulling out and looking at philosophical and moral issues. And what that series is really about, in a lot of ways, is freedom of conscience. And Nimue / Merlin / Nimue, you know, yes, is a machine with a human memory who believes in God. Okay? And it never crosses his or her mind not to, despite the fact that she's dealing with a mess created by somebody who set out to create an artificial religion based on a lie. And there are characters in Safehold who find themselves being deists or not even really sure God still exists. But one of the things that you have to bear in mind about Safehold is Safehold has effectively 1,000 years of written history, which is all totally consistent, and all of which, it starts with the writing of 8 million literate people who literally lived through the day of creation and left their impressions about it. There is not a single living person on Safehold when Merlin turns up who does not believe in God, and does not believe in God as taught by the Church of God Awaiting. Okay? Not one human being, except for that tiny handful of characters in Telesburg, the Brethren of Saint-Germain, who you don't even meet until like book 3 or 4. Okay.
I'll never forget reading that part and I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but just getting to that part when that question is asked and going,
wait a minute, where did that come from? Well, and so what we're dealing with here is less a question about does or does not God exist. I have my view of it. Michael Steinair, in a lot of ways, is my viewpoint character in the series. But the point becomes, how do you deal with the consequences and the moral implications of what you believe? Okay? And how are you driven by your concept? Are you going to be a Schulerite who is like unquestioningly following the prescriptions of the Book of Schuler and the Holy Writ and whatnot? Or are you going to stop and say, wait, okay, whatever the Book of Schuler may say, all right, if God is a God of love, you know, where does this come from? You know, and even people who are just reformists who are concerned about the corruption of the Group of Four and whatnot in the church, in the vicarate, are really, whether they realize it or not, moving towards a rejection or a modification of the Book of Schuler. And so it's also looking at the evolution of religion and of men and women's understanding of God. My personal view is that I probably have about as much ability to visualize the completeness and totality of God as an amoeba has to visualize the completeness and the totality of me. Okay? That being the case, I'm not prepared to tell anyone that their view of God is totally and inescapably wrong. Okay? I can say to them, you know what, the God that I worship would never tolerate the kind of crap that you're talking about doing to other people in His name. Okay? And I would argue that to put on my Methodist lay speaker's hat for a moment, I would argue that God can touch any human being, but the extent to which that human being can visualize God is going to be different in every case. It's like the collaboration between an author and his readers in a lot of ways. There's a line in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle where the young Calorman has been thrown through the stable door. He's dead. He's on the other side. He doesn't realize it yet. And he meets Aslan for the first time. And he realizes he's never seen anything so magnificent, so wonderful. And he goes to his knees and he says, you know, in effect, he's waiting for Aslan to kill him because he's worshipped Tash all his life. And Aslan says to him more or less, you know, why are you so afraid, you know? And he says, because, you know, I've worshipped Tash all my life, and, you know, and Aslan says, no, you never really understood, did you? He says, you can do no good thing in the name of Tash, and you can do no bad thing in my name. So whether you knew it or not, when you were doing the good things,
you were doing them in my name.
Exactly. And that to me is an integral part of the fact that God created all human beings. And He really is not a happy camper, I'm pretty sure, when we go around killing each other in His name. Yeah. Now, I don't think that means that He expects you to stand by and allow evil to be done, to allow evil to flourish. Okay? But there's a whole huge difference between doing that and saying, you know, I'm not going to let you live your life the way you believe you do, the way you want to live it, the way you believe God wants you to live it, as long as you are doing no harm to anyone around you, go for it.
And harm none, do as thou wilt.
Pretty much, pretty much. I mean, I think everybody has, no matter how ecumenical they want to be about it, everyone has his or her own set of rules and standards. And for good or ill, we are going to form opinions about others which are going to be colored by those rules and those standards. And it doesn't matter how inclusive we try to be, that's going to happen. There is, however, a point at which you get to choose whether or not you're going to allow those perceptions to dictate how you relate to other human beings. And that's the point at which I think a moral human being has to stop. I read a book a month or two ago, about the time that we were doing Con Carolinas, called The Wrong Kind of Muslim. And I cannot remember the author's name, but he's an Ahmadi. His family's from Pakistan, but he was raised in the States. It's a very, very interesting book that I highly recommend, because he is not regarded, the Ahmadis are not regarded as Muslims in Pakistan. They're regarded as blasphemers and heretics. The only Pakistani to ever win a Nobel Prize was a scientist who was an Ahmadi. And after the blasphemy laws were enacted in the 1970s, somebody went back and chiseled the word Muslim off of his grave marker, because he's no longer considered to be a true Muslim. The Ahmadis are a non-violent sect, and they educate their girls right alongside their boys. They run a lot of hospitals, and I'm not sure that I am a Christian, okay, so I'm not sure that I can really buy into their basic, concepts about who the Messiah is, because we have to agree to differ on that. But the author of this book makes a point which I think should be written in stone everywhere. The great religions of the world have far more in common than they have separating them in terms of how we're supposed to live with our fellow, and it would be kind of cool if we concentrated on that. And that, I won't say that that's really what drove the Safe Hope books, because the Safe Hope books are more proactive, I guess, than that. But the fundamental struggle, the difference between the Church of Charis and the Church of God Awaiting, is the Church of Charis's absolute insistence on the fact that everyone who considers himself or herself a child of God has to have consciously made that decision. Okay?
Makes sense.
And to that extent, I get to play with ideas and concepts. Now, I have to say that I was in Poland, and I was at a convention, and it was like the medieval banquet that they had every night. The convention was held in a rebuilt Teutonic Knights castle. In Poland. It's a small castle, not a castle. Anyway, so we were at and I was sitting there talking, and this guy who was well into the vodka at the other end, I'd been talking to, it was a really interesting conversation. I had two people who were lapsed Catholics. I had one person who was violently anti-church, okay. I had a guy who was performed every Easter in the Passion Play, in Warsaw. I mean, it was an interesting, I think I was probably the only Protestant present, but aside from that, it was very interesting. And this guy sitting at the table and he finally says, we thought we were getting big military men, and all you want to talk about is God. You know, I was like, well, no, not really. That's where the conversation went, you know, kind of thing. And he was gently urged away from me by a couple of other fans. But I think some science fiction readers are uncomfortable with religion. I think that some science fiction readers are anti-religion. And in some instances, I fully understand that. If you feel like you've been folded, spindled, and mutilated by religion, or by society in general, or if you are one of those people who simply argues that there is no acceptable evidence of the existence of a supreme being, and if there were one, he wouldn't let us get into the messes we get into, I can respect the intellectual basis of that argument. Okay, so it's when I say that there are people who have an anti-religious bent, I don't envision them
frothing at the mouth.
Yeah, I mean, there are some who are, just as there are some people who take their religion in a way that I'm pretty sure God would be upset with them about, and froth at the mouth and try to impose their views on everybody else in sight. Okay, like I said, I'm a student of history, so I've seen both. But I do think that in the Safehold books, I've had an opportunity to bring that question front and center in a way that I haven't attempted to do in the other books. And at the same time, it's allowed me to write what I think is a pretty good story about battle and bloodshed and sudden death and all those things God doesn't want us to do in His name. Because sometimes it's kind of like Burke, okay? In order for evil to triumph, it is only necessary that good men do nothing. And that is also something that ties into that responsibility-taking aspect of my thinking.
Well, you know, every time we've spoken so far, you know, you brought up your fans, and it seemed like fans are very, very important to you. What do you think about having basically your own official fan club, the Royal Manticorian Navy, of which I'm a part of?
Well, when I get you recruited up to strength, it'll be time for the coup.
Ah,
okay?
Got it.
No, I think it's great. I am a little bit in two places where the fan club itself is concerned, and the reason I say that is, I am tickled pink that you guys are out there, that you enjoy the books. I love some of the stuff that you are doing that I think is so good for the people around you who are not even part of the fan club. And I am incredibly flattered and pleased that you are that deeply invested in the books. But by the same token, it's your organization, okay? And I want to maintain that distance in that sense of its being your organization, not something that I'm trying to direct or shape or control. Okay, if you know, somebody wants to ask me a question about how does this aspect of the Honorverse, how do you see it working, you know, that kind of thing, then I will be delighted to answer the question. I am always happy to be available as a resource to the fan club. I'm incredibly flattered when you guys say, you know, oh, we're doing a pod launch, drop by, you know, that kind of thing. It's wonderful. It is absolutely wonderful. But by the same token, I want to be very sure that I don't start turning into some kind of backseat passenger with delusions of driving, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah. It's very important to me that you guys be free to do what you want to do. And I want it to be an enjoyable experience for you. I want it to be something that you do because you enjoy the companionship, you enjoy the books, you enjoy the activities. And so that's why it may seem sometimes that I'm a little passive when fans get together, because I'm trying really hard not to be like, well, I think you guys ought to, sort of thing. And there are folks in the fan club who have become personal friends, not to name any names, but people who we've met through the club who have become a part of our lives that is really cool. But I certainly don't expect everybody in the fan club to do that. And I've observed, it seems to me, that internally the organization is very protective of being and of sharing. And not just from, like making sure we're covered with where we need to be at a convention, or the way that you guys stepped up with the kids at Con Carolinas to find things for them to do and whatnot, but also to protect us from the fan club, to make sure that it doesn't intrude into our lives, or start, well, we have another question we need to ask David, kind of thing. I mean, the experience for us at this point, I think, has been entirely positive. Okay, I can't think of anything that's happened that I would have put into a negative column in any way, and that's unusual. I think. I will say too that you guys have strong views as a group on the Evergreen project. Some of you are like, yeah, let's go. Others like, oh my God, they're going to ruin it. But that's because you figure Hollywood's going to ruin anything that comes along. But I will say that Evergreen recognizes the fan base, and especially you guys, as being integral to their success in envisioning the movie project. And there are things that they are going to do that fans aren't going to like, that they're going to do because there are either technical constraints, or there are constraints in how they think they need to package it for an audience that isn't as immersed in the Honorverse as you guys are. And I've said this before, but my goal is, there is nobody who's a Tolkienite and who has seen The Lord of the Rings who can't effortlessly tell you 12 things that they did completely wrong.
Right.
But there are very few Tolkienites who don't get to the end of it and say, but damn, they did a good job. Okay?
The movies were still enjoyable.
Yeah. Well, and they were not only enjoyable, but they were enjoyable within the context of Tolkien's universe, even if they didn't get all of it right. Yeah. I know exactly what actually I have 14, not 12, but I mean, everybody has them. Okay?
I had the same with the new Star Trek.
Yeah, well, mine starts with Faramir the Woos. Okay? All right, we start there. But overall, and when you think about the sheer chutzpah involved with Jackson and being willing to take that franchise on, okay, outstanding job. I will be satisfied if an Honor Harrington movie gets made that gets that response out of the hardcore. It's like, crap, the ships were wrong, but they got the tactics right.
Yeah.
Okay, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean I'm not going to push as hard as I can to get it right by the literary canon. But it means that I recognize going in that we're not going to be able to do everything absolutely by canon from the books. I don't know if the evolution of the uniforms from that gray tone monstrosity in the comic books, if you looked at okay, I'm not absolutely positive at this point, but I think what we're really seeing in conceptual art that's been shared is more of a skin suit, their take on the skin suit, than on the everyday uniform. I'm not positive about that, but I think that's what's going on. So, you know, that's segueing rather far afield from the fan club itself.
No, but that's a perfect segue into my next question, which really was, what we know Honor Carrington has the comic book series. Yep. There's games out. If you haven't downloaded Tales of Honor, you really should. Or I'm sorry, The Secret Fleet. Yep. Tales of Honor is the comic. Yep. And now, of course, we know that there's a movie coming out. Yep. So what else? What can you tell us about those, and what else is in the pipeline?
Well, there's not a lot more in the pipeline beyond the movie project, the comic books, and the game. Basically evergreen, and as I say, you know, wearing the T-shirt. They view this as a cross-platform project. The real function of the comic books at this point, in great part, is to try and expand awareness. Same thing with the game. To try to expand awareness of Honor Harrington and the Honorverse beyond the core readership that we already have. If you sell 20,000 copies, 40,000 copies of a hardcover book in a fairly tight window, that gets you onto the New York Times list. Okay? If every single Honor Harrington fan in the entire universe bought 5 tickets to an Honor Harrington movie and came, and that was all, the movie would be a dismal failure financially. So what you are looking at is an absolute need to do a movie that will appeal to people who do not have the immersion in the series that, like you guys in the fan club, have.
So maybe we should be doing some evangelizing.
Well, that's kind of what they would like you to be doing, and that's one of the functions of the comic book, is if you know someone who is into comic books but doesn't read, you know, I don't want to call it literary science fiction because comic books are literature, but of a different, you know, different genre, but who don't read novels, okay, then the comic book is one way to get your foot in the door. So is the game. It's also something that hopefully people who never heard of Honor Harrington before will see, you know, ooh, this sounds cool, or whatever, and take a look at. And so the idea here is to help prepare the ground, if you will, for the movie. The comic books are also being used as a tool to help develop the conceptual art and so forth for a movie. They are a work in progress, and I think a lot of folks were
upset.
Yeah, especially with the first couple of issues, because it was like, my God, where did this come from? And I have to say that I was one of them in some ways. I will say that Top Cow used concept art that had been provided to them from Evergreen for the beginning process. And part of the problem, I think, is that when the original conceptual art was done, the fellow who was doing the original conceptual art had read, like, Basilisk and maybe Honor of the Queen, and that was all. Just about everybody at Evergreen has now read all of the novels.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's so that they're all on kind of the same page on where they're going. And Matt Hawkins at Top Cow, I think, has done a very good job of adapting the novels to a comic book format. And they do send the script for the comic book by me for comments and whatnot. Now, the windows that I have to make the comments on have been very tight. For example, I got issue number 3 while I was in Canada at a convention. And I got them on a Friday, and they said, we need them back by Saturday noon. But it was noon West Coast time. But I was like, great, you know, so I had to really jump in and run through there. A big part of that is that production schedules in the comic industry are even crazier than most. And another part of it is that Evergreen, I think very wisely in this respect, wants my comments sent to them so that they can combine them with their comments before they send them to Top Cow, to Matt, so that we don't have too many ladles stirring that broth and lose, and I think that's very wise on Evergreen's part, but it does put more constraints on the time flow. And there are a couple of things that got past me in, like, especially issue number 2, I think, that might have been number 3. But for example, the character of Andres Venizelos, who is Honor's exec in Honor of the Queen, he kind of gets lost in the comic book because he's deployed out of the ship to do the commerce stuff. And we don't go back to see him. Those scenes are less central to where the storyline has to go as it was to where the characters were going, if you follow me. And Matt's been focusing on where the storyline is going. And so Andreas kind of just dropped off the scope, and there's not a good way to really pull him back in now. And if I'd realized, had more time to think about it and realized the implications of doing that, I would have said something about it early enough that there might have been an opportunity to fix it. And it's my fault that I didn't. Okay, I'm not blaming anybody else for it. I'm just saying this is one of the things that happens. They've been very good overall in giving, in actually acting on the suggestions that I've made.
That's good. I know that was something a lot of fans were concerned about. You know, how much do you actually have creative control?
Well, I have no creative control. Okay, and I don't want it. And there are 2 reasons for that.
Okay.
One is that in both comic books and movies, we're working in media that I am not as competent in as I am in writing stories. Now, there are some elements that are, because you're telling a story either way, so it's not that I feel totally out of my depth, but what I'm saying is that when I did advertising, I learned that if I gave the artist too much direction, I didn't get the artist's best work. Okay, because he got too tied up in trying to do exactly what I wanted him to do, and it stiffened, for want of a better word, what he was doing. So these are not my media. I don't feel that I'm qualified to, Now I'll argue with them that I think this is the way you should do it, etc. And I will be very clear but I'm not going to say, and it has to be done that way. Okay. The second reason that I specifically did not want creative control is kind of a little bit twofold. But one is, unless you have screenplay, script, shooting, and editing control, you don't have control.
Okay.
Okay? Because by the time you do 4 hours worth of movie that has to be edited down into 2, okay, decisions are going to have to be made about which plot strand do you prune or whatever. One of my favorite examples is the second Terminator movie. When John asks the Terminator, is there some way you could learn to be less dorky? And the Terminator says there's a dip switch. Okay, well, the way the movie finally hit the theaters, the assumption is the dip switch had been set before he was sent back for him to learn. Okay, in fact, that wasn't the case. They had to take the dip switch out and reset it in that same garage where they are after busting her out. And there's a scene which is shot with Linda Hamilton's twin sister, okay, where she actually has the back of his head open, and the twin sister is on this side of the camera with a stand-in for John. And there's a bust of Schwarzenegger with the top of his head off. And then there's a mirror that actually has no glass in it that is Linda Hamilton and Schwarzenegger and whatnot while they're doing the whole thing. And she takes the dip switch out. Okay. And then she takes it over to this oil drum. She gets this big hammer and she's going to smash it. And John sticks his hand out and, and she just barely misses smashing John's hand with the hammer. And he's like, what are you doing? And she's like, you don't understand, we can't trust it. This thing, just like it killed your father, you know, the whole 9 yards. And John is like, no, we need him. We're dead without him. And she says, you can't trust him. He's got to go, more or less. And John finally looks at her and he says, look, if I'm this military genius who's supposed to save humanity, I think it's time my mom started listening to me. We need him. He moves his hand away and says, but you do whatever you think you need to do. And she tries like 3 more times and she can't bring herself to bring the hammer down on him. And that's the point in the original screenplay and the original script at which John becomes the leader of the party. And that's why she has to sneak away when she goes after, you know, and that whole sequence where he's looking at the kids right on the border where they've got the guns, and he says, I'm beginning to understand your species, you know, kind of thing. That's because the dip switch has been reset, and that leads directly to the point at which at the end of the movie he says, no, there's one left. Okay? They cut that scene, as I understand it, because it let them cut about another 20, 30 minutes that played directly off of it to get the movie down. Okay? But as the author of that screenplay, of that script, I would have fought tooth and nail against taking that scene out because of how much impact it had on the story as I visualized it. The story the audience got worked just fine. Okay? But that's one reason. But the other reason is that I'm running no financial risk at all in producing this movie.
Oh.
Okay?
Okay.
I mean, you know, they pay me rights money. If the movie succeeds, I make more money. If the movie fails, I don't make money. But I don't lose money, whatever happens. Okay? So in that sense, I do not have a dog in the fight where it comes to how it's going to be marketed and merchandised and so forth. That doesn't mean that I would love to see it done more successfully rather than less successfully. But what it means is that Evergreen are the people who are running all of the risk involved with this project. And since they are the ones running the risk, I think they have not only a legal but a moral right to ultimately make the decisions about how they're going to expose themselves to that risk. And I can tell them, I can say, I think if you do it this way, you are going to lose a lot of the essence of the story, and that the movie will be less successful than it would have been otherwise. I can tell them that. I can believe that. I can, you know, ultimately they're the ones who have to make that decision. And I don't want, on the one hand, I don't want to put it a little crudely, to get into a pissing contest with them. And on the other hand, I don't see myself as having the right to tell them, no, you cannot do that. I will tell them, no, I think the existing fan base won't understand why you did that. I can tell them, no, I think that's going to make a problem down the road if we go as many movies as you want to. This character has to be here because of the role that character plays there, you know, kind of thing. I can do that kind of thing, and I will. And they have solicited my comments. They want them. So far, you know, we're not in 100% accord, but they have been respectful of what they have asked me about and what I've told them about, and I have been respectful of why they are doing what they are doing, even if I don't necessarily agree 100% with what they're doing. And that's probably about the best it's going to get in a project like this, because this, you know, you asked about collaborations.
Yeah.
Okay, a movie is a collaboration by scores of people. The author of the screenplay, the scriptwriter, the actors, the directors, the editors, you know, everybody. And in that sense, you have to be able to back away from the my way or the highway mentality, I think. Maybe if you're a director who's, you know, I have to impose my vision on the movie, etc., maybe you can't afford to be that way. But I think that at this stage of the process, that's where I need to be. And the other thing is, it's absolutely essential to me, as I see it at this point, that I remain someone who is a resource for Evergreen, and not somebody who is an obstacle for Evergreen. Now, if they did something that I just totally, oh my God, which I don't visualize happening, but if they did that, I might be inclined to say, okay, you guys suit yourself, I hope the screen doors isn't hitting you in the butt on the way out, kind of thing. But I would never say to them, no, you cannot do that. And I would also probably, even if that happened, I would never, take, as some people have, take to Facebook and Twitter to say, oh, they butchered my work, don't go see it, kind of thing. Okay?
Well, is there, we're kind of, I guess, heading towards the end of our interview, with all the questions that I've got. My last question to you is, what is it, with all the questions that we've asked so far, and with all the discussion we've had, is there anything that you've wanted to say, or anything, projects coming down the pipeline that you've wanted to talk about that I didn't ask you about?
Well, let's see. I am in the final edit now of Safehold, I think number 8, Hell's Foundation's Quiver. Once that is finished, Joel Presby and I will be looking at the third of the Multiverse books, which I believe is titled The Road to Hell. Now, I consider that the Multiverse series, not the Hell's Gate series, but everybody else calls it the Hell's Gate series. I'm like, okay. It's kind of like I regard the Mutineers Moon books as the Dahak series, and I'm not sure what other people call them. Anyway.
I think the common name for it.
Let's see, and then after that, Tim and Tom and I get our heads together on the second of the Manticore Ascendant books. We will all three be in Atlanta at least Thursday night. Sharon and I will be there for all of DragonCon now. So will Tim. I think Tom will be there Friday. He might not be there Saturday. He and Diana, the kids, are going to Universal down in Florida, and they're driving from Pennsylvania on their way down. So anyway, so that will be, and then the next project after that for me is the first volume of my fantasy magnum opus, set in which Norfressa and Kantavar finally square off again for the final war between good and evil in the Norfressan universe. Most, not all, because of the time frame involved, but many, at least, of the primary characters in the existing Bazel novels will be very, very important secondary characters in the magnum opus. And the body count will be very high by the time I get to the end. I have to say that one of the things, going back to the question of responsibility, the scene where Tomanek is having his first conversation with Bazel, and Bazel says, it's no use, you cannot, I'm not going to, bow down to you and worship you, and, all the rest of it. Tomanek says, what makes you think that's what I want you to do? Okay, he says, I got enough people who do that. Okay, I need somebody who actually does things. Okay, somebody who your integrity, your sense of, Bazel says to it more or less, what I do, I'll do because I think it's the right thing to do. And Tomanek is saying to him, and it's because you think that's the right thing to do that I want you and need you, kind of thing. Which is kind of the flip side of the view of well, I want to do the right thing because, that, you see. But that too is part of the whole concept of human responsibility and freedom of conscience, and and now I have to say that one of the things that I really liked when I first created Norfressa and is it's really magic in Norfressa is really, in a lot of ways, if you look at it, it's quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Is how they make the magic work. They just don't call it that. Yeah.
I noticed that when you, at one point you talk about delving basically into the matter that makes up everything, which is quantum mechanics.
Yes, yeah. So it's just like, they got a different set of tools for dealing with. And that actually goes back also to the multiverse. Because what you guys haven't seen yet, because we haven't gotten there, is in Sharona, you have one set of physics that governs. It's basically Newtonian physics.
Yeah.
And the speed of light in Sharona, by the way, is instantaneous. Okay? And there is ether. Okay?
Nice.
All right. And then over here, you have this universe where magic works. And you will discover that magic hardly works at all in Sharona. And physics hardly work at all in Arcana. But that in the universes in between, where you don't have a substantial human population yet, both sets of rules work equally well.
Oh.
And what happens is that as the population grows, expecting one set of rules to work, it tilts the balance in that universe more and more towards that set of physics. And then eventually, if the series goes where I originally projected it to go, we get involved when a portal opens in Georgia and takes a chunk out of Stone Mountain, opening up, takes the rear right off Stonewall Jackson's horse, and a couple of dragons come through. Okay? All of that would happen about 80, 90 years after the first contact between Arcana and Sharona. And there are actually clues buried in the first book, if you look, that will tell you exactly when that's happening, because there's like a reference to Krakatoa under another name, and exactly how many years before the events of the book that happens. If you go back and look up the date of Krakatoa, you can track your way forward. But the question becomes, and what the Arcanans figure out first, is that in theory, you can tilt the entire multiverse to work one way or the other. Okay? And it also turns out, if we ever get there, that there is a fourth player in the game who isn't even human, but who is responsible for the way everything is set up.
Ooh.
Okay?
That'll be nice.
But the problem is getting there to do the books. What we're going to do for right now, what we're shooting for, is to do the second two of the 4-book initial story that Linda and I set out to do. And we will then have a resting place. We won't be involved in it yet. It'll still be Arcana and Sharona. The first war will be, at an end, etc. So if we need to, we can leave the series there, or we can move on to what we had visualized for the remainder of the book series. But see, that's one of my problems. I like to do big series, okay? And there's only one of me.
Yeah.
Somebody said, well, you should get a pica. And my response to that was, if I get another pica, sorry, he just starts spinning off more series of his own, it would not really be a solution to my problem. I'm going to run out of time before I tell all the stories I want to tell.
We hope you leave us enough outlines so that more can carry on.
Well, I think that one of the things that I will be doing in the not too distant is putting some of those outlines, together. I mean, there are people who I've talked to who know where I plan to go with this, that, or the other, but I haven't actually. I actually started at one point to write the final novel in the Honorverse story, and just put it on the shelf.
Yeah.
The problem is that it would have been what became at all costs. So beyond that stage now, and Honor doesn't die heroically the way she was supposed to in the original storyline. And in some ways I'm happy, and in other ways, you know, it leaves me with a problem, because she has definitely become, you know, it's kind of like the reason why Niven stopped writing the Ringworld stories. I haven't actually discussed this with him, but I understand, I know Larry, and I understand, I can see him saying this, that he'd reached a point at which there was nothing, no problem that his technological bag couldn't have already fixed. So it's like, you know, where do I go from here? I can see that. I can see that. And so far, fortunately, I haven't hit that point. But I'm a little bit in that point in the Honor Harrington stories right now, because everything got pulled forward 25 years or so. And that means that the Solarian League is far further outclassed in warfighting capability than they were supposed to be. And so the battles are more like, you know, clubbing baby chicks than actual, you know, conflict between peer powers.
You could call them as propaganda for the TRMN. You could call them the Solarian Union.
Yeah, I suppose I could, but I'm not going to. But, you know, and I probably will be bringing that part of the Honorverse storyline to a conclusion in another maybe 3 novels. And then, at the very least, there will be a hiatus in universe.
Yeah.
There may very well be a hiatus in my universe, too. Partly because the Honorverse is so big, there are other parts of it that can be explored. And basically, I've come up with what I think will work as a resting point, a conclusion, that will leave the reader realizing that there are perils yet unresolved, but nobody's going to be expecting the assassin to sneak up behind Honor in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. I really, really like Honor Harrington, and I really, really like the Honorverse. And it's grown into an entity and an environment that offers all kinds of scope for stories beyond the original concept of Honor Harrington herself. By the same token, I've been doing it for a long time, and I've managed to stay fresh by having other projects that I would pull off and do, which is one advantage to having multiple series. But I don't know. You actually kind of reach a point in a series where you're worried about your ability to sustain for the reader, okay? Not for yourself, okay? But to sustain for the reader that sense of immediacy in the universe. You will always have some readers who came into the series who will be like, as long as you write more stories about the characters I love, I'll buy them.
Yeah.
Okay? And that is always wonderful for a writer. But by the same token, you want to be in a place where someone who came to the series for the first time in this book would find it a sufficiently enjoyable and compelling experience that they actually wanted to go and look for the other books. You see what I'm saying? And sometimes you just need to kind of say, okay, I need to take a deep breath. I need to take a break before I try to do the next book in that series. For me, much more often than that, it's just a question of how do I manage the logistics for the numbers of books that I need to get written. I've averaged historically about 3 books a year for 20 years. to do when I was 35 than it is coming up on 62.
Yeah.
Okay. So I probably am going to have to back off a little bit on the pace. This current safe hold was technically supposed to be delivered at the end of April. And it's unusual for me to be this far behind on a deadline, but Eric was behind on his deadline for Cauldron of Ghosts, and we didn't really get started on that until after HonorCon last year. So if you look at when that book was released,
wow.
look at when we got started on it, you know, it was like a to get it done.
Crunch.
Yeah, but it also meant that it was February before I was even able to think about beginning on the next safe hold. And then Sharon had another spinal surgery in February. So that put us back. And also somehow we wound up with 8 cons on the schedule for this year. And that was before DragonCon was added to it. And it was also before the Czech fans said, oh, you're going to be in Poland, you've got to come back to Czechoslovakia. And I'm like, oh, you know, twist my arm, you know. But every con takes a week out of my writing schedule. So we try to hold it to 4 to 5 cons a year. And this year, counting the Czech trip as a con, okay, as opposed to just the Polish trip, we're looking at 10. So that's been a problem this year too. We've already got 2015 locked. You know, we're not going to do any more there. Of course, DragonCon was not on the list for this year either. But somebody asked me, they said, you know, why do you still do cons? It's not like you need the publicity and so forth. And they take away from your writing time, etc. And I'm like, I do cons for the same reason that the fan club is important to me. Okay, the bottom line is that aside from how I'm going to, you know, pay the bills and hopefully put the kids through college, the books are about their audience. Okay? And it's not just ego stroking for me that I've sold 7, 8 million books. Okay. It's that the product that I'm putting together, the world that I'm building, and the people that I'm putting into it are important enough to these people that they want to be there.
Yeah.
They're not family people who have to read it. Okay, these are people who voluntarily enter into the literary world of my making. Okay? I don't think there is an honest author in the world who won't tell you that that is incredibly satisfying. It's validating what we do.
Yeah.
Okay? And cons are an opportunity for that validation. They're also an opportunity for me to spend time with people who have paid me that supreme compliment of liking my work enough that they want to invite me over to their convention to play. Okay? And I feel that I have a direct relationship with my fans that a lot of authors and a lot of actors don't have. Some of them don't want. Okay? I don't see it that way. And one of the things that Evergreen found when they did their fanology, I call it fanoscopy, but they did a study of online commentary and so forth, trying to analyze, and they found that the Honorverse fandom identifies me personally very strongly with the Honorverse to an extent that really is not the average in literary circles. That's not to say that there isn't always a core group of fans who strongly identify this author with this work that I love, but it seems to be more broad spread in the case of the Honorverse. I think that may be because of the fact that I enjoy doing cons, and I enjoy interacting with fans on davidweber.net whenever I can take the time away from the project I'm currently working on, that kind of thing. And to be honest, I think part of it is because I respect my fans. Okay, I respect their right to view parts of the book differently from the way that I do. I don't, for want of a better term, it's never occurred to me to write down to my fans.
Yeah.
Okay. I expect them to
They've done their homework.
yeah, well, not only have they done their homework, but they're smart people, okay? And I expect them to understand, where I'm going and whatnot. And I have strong views about, like, YA, and whether or not you should write down to your audience just because they're younger, less experienced readers. And so, to me, I do not consider myself to be an artist. I consider myself to be a craftsman. I don't consider myself to be an author. I consider myself to be a storyteller. Okay? And that's the level at which I want to interact with the fans. I like people. And I like to be around people, and I like to have the notion that I'm giving something to people. And the fact that they wind up giving back to me the way that you guys in the fan club have, and that my readership in general has, is simply to me a ratification that we must be doing something right. Okay? And that's the way I see it.
We the fans definitely appreciate it, and appreciate you for, again, the universe that you've given us, for taking the time today to, this has been over 2 hours that we have spent, that you've just basically answered every question we could think of, and we really appreciate that.
Oh.
Now you're going to be, I know you said you're going to be at Dragon Con. I'm going to try to get this out before Dragon Con. I know you're also going to be at HonorCon in Raleigh, North Carolina.
From there, we're going straight to Poland.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Check, please.
Yeah, well, we're supposed to, originally, we were going to rent a car to drive to Raleigh from Greenville, and only drive as far south as Charlotte to catch the airplane to fly to Poland. However, it occurred to us that Election Day falls in that cycle.
Yep.
So we're trying to reschedule now so that we can maybe fly out of Greenville, Spartanburg instead of Charlotte, and vote the day before we get on the plane to leave. And then the Polish con people are coordinating with the Czechs, and we're going to go by train from our Polish con, which is in eastern Poland. It's near Ukraine. And then from there to Prague, to the Czech Republic. And then our Czech fans, who took really good care of us when we were over there a few years ago, are going to be like, okay, now we're going to show you the things we didn't have time to show you then.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was doing the final final proofread on one of the Safehold books. Tor emailed the PDF to my Polish publisher, who printed it out, and I'm on the train trying to read. I'm sitting in the hotel room while Sharon is running around Prague Castle with the Czechs, got it done, but we were really in a crunch for time.
So your last North American con this year, though, will be HonorCon.
I think so. We've got still one in Minnesota that I think this year is still on the calendar.
Okay.
Sharon is the keeper of the calendar. I basically, there was a movie when I was in high school that was called, I think, If It's Tuesday, This Must Be Belgium.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's kind of, if this is September, then
this must be Con Carolina's. You know.
Well, we are going to be interviewing the Duchess next, so I'll be sure to ask her so that we can get your full schedule down for the year. But Mr. Weber, Duke Luton Vale, creator of Honor Harrington, thank you very much for this interview. On behalf of the TRMN and Honor Harrington fans, Safehold fans, your myriad Universes fans, want to thank you for this interview. We really appreciate it, and thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it.